Okay, so the big sprite import did work. Like I said, the problems with it didn't take long to fix. It loaded everything, but there were some slight misalignments with the fringes that basically took the morning to fix. It was a bit of some problems with my code and one tiny misalignment in one of John's sprites. And we both fixed our respective parts of that, and now it all fits together perfectly, and it's beautiful. So, Deco Sprites are the next thing to do, and I started on that yesterday. So the morning was fixing fringes, the afternoon was starting on Deco Sprites. I've written the system that reads them in now, and most of the work was just coming up with what is the system, how does it work at all, because the Deco Sprites are very different between different factions. And so it's a question of what can you make universal and what has to be faction specific. And if it's all faction specific, that's way too much unique code to write for each one. And if it's all universal, that's too restrictive for coming up with what these factions have aboard their ships, where they live and stuff like that. So I split it into categories, and every faction will have to have some kind of Deco Sprites in the living category, so bunks, mess halls and stuff. Some in... to be honest, after that it gets trickier. Right now I have brig, security, and I don't know why I'm doing air quotes on that. They are strings in the game, so that's why I'm doing air quotes. Security, brig, which sound very similar, and are, and medical. It's tricky because medical is almost always only one sprite, and so I suppose it's not really a problem. The point is that the reason they have to be in categories is when you generate a ship, if you have a big room of like 2 by 3 modules, like a big room, it's going to need multiple Deco Sprites, and if they are of different types, it looks weird. It looks dumb to have, you know, a gym in the middle of the prison. And so when it makes a sector like that, it's got to pick one type and then just draw from that. And so there's so many different ways of doing it. Like, you know, the types could be individual arrays. The way I'm actually doing it is that all Deco Sprites are one big array, and there's a separate array for which type each of those Deco Sprites is, and then when you ask for a Deco Sprite of a certain type, it goes through and looks until it finds all the ones that match that type, and then makes another list and then picks randomly from that. And that makes reading them in a lot easier. Reading them in, we're doing it by file names, so if you name a thing Deco Living Bunks 1, then it knows it's a Deco Sprite, so it'll read it in. It knows it's in the living category because it sees that there. And it doesn't care that the name is bunks, it ignores that part. And it looks at the number at the end, and if you specify a number, then that's how many of them there can be on a ship. If you don't specify a number, there can be as many as you like. So bunks, actually, you wouldn't specify a number because it doesn't matter if there's loads of them. But for things like sick bay, it's kind of weird if there's 10 of those. And that works. I was a little bit disappointed. That took a long time to plan it, and then after I planned it, it was like, it wasn't that late, but I just felt kind of like exhausted from the mental effort. And not so much exhausted, it was that I'd planned this thing and I'm not 100% sure it's right. I think it's right, it's the best thing I can come up with, but it's not one of those things where everything just clicks into place and all, like, the system you come up with perfectly matches the thing you're trying to systematize. And so when I'm not confident of my approach, I kind of drag my feet. I don't dive straight into it and write a load of code, because part of me is still worried, this might be wrong, I don't want to put too much effort until I know it's right. But also, a lot of times in game development, you can't know it's right until you make it, so I just had to make it. But it took me a long time to get the motivation back to actually write this thing without totally knowing if it's the right way to do it. And I did write it, and it worked. And I went about it in a quite productive way, where I didn't try and make it all work right away. I just had it just read in the file name, just strip out the extension, and just tell me what word you got from that. And then check that works before writing any other code. And then, okay, we've got that word, now see if you can recognise the first part as Deco. Yes, you did, great. And then change it again, and each little part of it I tested individually and had it log it at every stage. Usually I use my debug log function when something's broken, but this time I used it before anything went wrong, because I would know ahead of time if anything was going wrong. And so that worked really well, but then it was slightly disappointing when I tried it in action, because I realised, on a medium to large ship, even on those, you don't see a lot of Deco Sprites, because since I made the Deco Sprite system, I've also changed it so that The clusters of guards that we place around the ship, those kind of need to be in a place where it makes sense for a bunch of guards to hang out. And there are loads of Deco Sprites that fit that bill, but we don't categorise those yet. So for the time being, it replaces it with a security room, and that security room is in the style of the Foundry faction, and that overrules any Deco Sprite choice. So there are so many of those that, like, there are only about 4 Deco Sprites on the whole ship, and then it was interrupted by all these ugly Foundry Sprites that don't match the ship. I was testing an off-world ship, so it should have all been like beautiful, clean, futuristic white stuff, and instead it was dirty blue industrial stuff. So I didn't get to have that magic moment of like, I made the system and now it just looks beautiful. And this raises further questions, really, because if clusters are all over the place and clusters require certain deco types, maybe my system should be reflecting that. Maybe that's what my system should be catering to, is like, we need a list of all the types of deco sprites where a bunch of people can hang around in one. Because there are loads of deco sprites where like a lot of it is solid, so it'd be a terrible place for guards to hang out, like there's only a narrow path through it. So we do need some kind of way of flagging those. The tricky part is, at the time we create the sector, we don't know if we're going to put a cluster in there or not. So if we're creating a big like 3x1 room, we haven't yet decided whether a cluster of guards goes there. So when we put the deco sprites in, we don't know. Right now, later on, it replaces it with an appropriate one, but that appropriate one won't necessarily be the same type as the rest of the room. And so, okay, you could make sure every type of deco sprite has at least one sprite in it that can be used as a guard cluster home, but then that doesn't really fit with everything. Like, what does that look like for a medical sector? Like, why are 5 guards hanging around in the sick bay? So I don't totally know what the solution to that is. Is it a case of everywhere guards hang out is a certain type of place? Like, they would only hang out in the living quarters or the security offices, and they would never hang out in the brig or the medical bay. Or is it a case of picking the deco type after we've decided whether a guard cluster goes there? Yeah, that's the same question really. Like, if there has to be a connection between whether there's a guard cluster there or not, and what type of deco sprites we put in the whole sector, and not just in that one room of the sector, then how do we enforce that connection? I think we will have to either change the order. I don't really like this idea, but in fact, no, it's basically impossible to, not impossible, but it would be an absurd amount of work to switch the order so that guards are placed before we pick the deco sprite types with the current system. It would mean scrapping the current system. I think a better way to do it would be to pick deco types, just like leave the deco code alone, so as a sector is created, it picks a deco type. Then when we place a guard cluster in it, don't just change the sprite for that one room, one module, change it for the rest of the sector. So a sector is like a 3x1 room, and then the actual module that the guard cluster goes in is just one part of that, it's one of the 3. And we would have to go through the other 2 and change those to match the type, not necessarily the same sprite, but the same type. So if we place a guard cluster and you make that a security office, the rest of the modules in that sector need to be security style things as well. They shouldn't be bunks, for example. Maybe I'm drastically overthinking this. Maybe the number of combinations of deco sprites that actually look wrong is pretty small, and almost anything else goes well together. I'm pretty sure. A thing I'm pretty sure of is that the deco type for a room that guards are hanging out in shouldn't be the same for every cluster of guards, because there are a lot of clusters of guards. It's a feature of every ship. It's one of the few things that's kind of completely consistent and you could even say samey about ships. We're never going to do a sort of a ship with no guards, or at least you would never be on a mission on a ship with no guards. That's something I learned in Gunpoint, is if you don't put enemies on a level, people just hate the level. Just almost universally. No matter how interesting and complex the puzzle is that you put in there. So if you're making a game about getting past enemies, you've got to put enemies in every mission. So I wouldn't want it to be repetitive in that way. Like, if it's going to be functionally repetitive, it can't be visually repetitive as well. So I guess what I should do is look through all John's sprites and see which ones of these make sense to have guards hanging out in. I know just from memory the Sovereign faction has loads of really cool things that guards can hang out in because they're a giant corporation, and so they have a lot of like boardrooms and stuff, and so there's a lot of like natural places for guards to be hanging out. So I need to look at the other factions and see what those are. I think actually in some ways, I was thinking this is going to be a pain in the ass, but actually this sort of solves a problem, because when I was trying to classify these deco things, living is an easy one. There's loads of things that relate to just places where people need to live. But it was harder to classify the other ones. There's sort of like security is a weird word. Brig has to be its own thing because we will use that to place rescue targets. If your mission is to rescue someone, they'll be in a brig, and we have to know that that module will like not only just be vaguely brig themed, it needs to be an actual brig. There has to be an actual person there. So the brig type is only one sprite, it just has to be a brig. And we can also use that elsewhere and say like this whole sector is all brigs, and that's fine. So the other, maybe this is another category, is places guards can hang out. Thing is, it's not that simple, is it? Oh, is it? Okay. So the deco category would actually, this category would not involve any actual sprites that are good for guards to hang out in. It would be the set of sprites that go well with the one that guards can hang out in. But then again, you're getting back to the problem of like, if it's always the same sprite that they hang out in, that sucks. So you almost need one list for places guards can hang out, and then another list for the sprites that go well with that. So the decision I need to make to solve that problem is, let's assume we are going to have multiple different sprites for rooms that guards can hang out in. The question is, are all of those sprites of the same type, i.e. would they fit well together? If not, then it gets really complicated, because now you've got to have one set of sprites that guards can hang out in, one set of sprites of rooms that look right next to those rooms, but you need to know which of those rooms that look good next to those rooms matches up to which of those rooms the guards can be in, and that's, yeah. The simplest way to do that version would be like, okay, there's never going to be a guard cluster in the medical sector, but maybe for like security and living, there are places, both of those sets have a particular place where guards can hang out. So in living place, it might be the mess hall, like they all sit around the table, and that's where guards are. For security, it could be an office, and then that would just be hard-coded across all factions, so all factions can only have a guard cluster in a sector that, or any sector with a guard cluster will have to be living or security. And if I thought of a third type, then that, but they'd never be medical, and they probably wouldn't be brig. I think they can't be brig. My thought was that they can't be brig because you would never want to overwrite a brig that has a capture target in it, because that's the mission. If you replace that, you'd be fucked. But actually, probably I can avoid that some other way. So maybe it does make sense to have a cluster of guards in the brig. Like if you had a big enough room, you'd have a bunch of cells, and then you'd have like a sort of, again, a security office. I think I need a better word for like the sort of workplace type. In some cases there will be security offices. In other cases, maybe it's more like armories and I don't know. I need to think more about this, I think. So there's that, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So windows right now are not in the current tile set, and so those are all mismatched. You get foundry windows on an off-world ship. And is that it? There must be something else. It's that and the cluster problem, I think. Oh, and then terminals. So terminals right now are just little things that we embed in the walls, and their purpose is that they are the places that guards go on little errands to. And that's how you get guards alone, is you wait for them to go off to a terminal. Those are just, I think they're just like a sprite that I cut out of some other sprite that John made, and we haven't talked about what those will look like eventually, whether they stay as terminals or whether they become like Deco sprite specific hotspots. Like, oh, if you're going to the mess hall, you better go to this vending machine, and if you're going to the gym, then go to this bench. That sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? I think the terminals thing is way, way easier if we can make that work visually. and I don't think it needs to look super good. Like they don't. I don't think they need to be sort of like themed to the room they're in. I think they're just having computers in the walls is just a thing that you have in spaceships. They can be very different for different factions, but yeah, they could be pretty much universal. So yeah, I need to think more about Deco sprites and cluster guard locations, and I think in order to think it through properly, I need to look at the Deco sprites again, so I can do that.